Here you are. Good morning to all of you. I would like to begin on a personal note, if that's okay with you. Last May 2022, I turned 60 years old. And so I am now officially a Filipino senior citizen, a happy one at that, let me add. But in my life thus far, I can say that something like three-fourths of it have been and are in youth ministry. I say this of myself both as a product and as a practitioner of this ministry. First and foremost, my religious and priestly vocation is a grace-filled result of my being a recipient as a young boy at first, as an active student in a Catholic school, also in the scouting movement, and also in youth groups. And then later on, as a Salesian seminarian, very much exposed early on to the ABCs of youth ministry and of education. Later, as a young priest, I was given the task of specializing and qualifying myself further in this field of youth ministry. And now I am engaged in teaching and writing, still on the same field. As a Salesian of Don Bosco, I cannot help but being biased for our saintly father and founder and for his system of education and youth ministry, the so-called preventive system. I would put it in a very simple way. If the Society of Jesus has the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, we Salesians have the preventive system of St. John Bosco. Ironically, or even paradoxically, Don Bosco obtained some of his first inklings of this system, which he developed courtesy of his exposure as a young priest in a place where the opposite of the preventive system was used, and that is inside the prisons of Turin in Italy with the young inmates. From such experiences of his in the prison ministry, he resolved to be more proactive and preventive, precisely not to let young men, due to a lack of guidance and accompaniment, end up behind bars. And so then he began setting up his oratory or youth center for boys, gathering them as though in a family, welcoming them with unconditional acceptance and love, educating them in the faith, in literacy, and in technical skills. Eventually, he codified his experiences in a 9-page treatise, a practical guide to his system and approach. I, for my part, now am given the task of expounding on the principles of youth ministry from the perspective of new evangelization. For this, I will be using what I have studied and learned, and also my little experience. As a matter of fact, this talk of mine now serves as a good opportunity for me to synthesize and integrate something like 50 years or so of learnings and insights, summarized now into more or less 7 principles, or more exactly, as you will see later, 6+1. First, we need to clarify a few things, especially about new evangelization. As the perspective we are using, this clarification is crucial. Evangelization serves as our overarching perspective or paradigm in our drawing up the principles of youth ministry. After all, it is the energizing core and the most profound identity of youth ministry because of its fundamental importance, innate affinity, breadth of scope, and depth of meaning. Evangelization is a subject that constantly recurs in various other documents and studies in youth ministry. If we are to keep these in mind, we will certainly preserve the comprehensive and fundamental character of this most basic reality of both our faith and our church as Catholics. Evangelization, in fact, cannot be reduced or relegated to a mere component, department, or office, for example, in a parish or a diocese. By the same logic, we also rule out a narrow and inadequate understanding of evangelization as churchification. That's the term coined by Michael Warren. By this, he meant utilizing a church slash unchurched frame of reference, an image of affiliation or enlistment. Such a mechanical understanding of evangelization should give way instead to one of conversion and transformation. The result, that is, of a true and total reception and acceptance of the good news into one's life. And at the same time, lest we think that it is something entirely on our own individual efforts alone, evangelization depends essentially on the grace of God, and it occurs only from within the church community. It does not exist unless the evangelized accepts God's grace and experience conversion. And then throughout, inculturation is required. Moreover, looking at evangelization from a broader viewpoint is helpful and important. The author, Father Patrick Brennan, suggests even taking evangelization from a convergence perspective. Accordingly, the many diverse parish ministries, for example, all revolve around one mission: evangelization. The youth ministry principles I will be expounding on in the main body of my talk should be viewed pretty much in the same way, even if I may not be able anymore to elaborate on it more explicitly or thoroughly due to time constraints. But anyway, given now our specific context, which demands a certain urgency, we also now qualify evangelization with that important three-letter word: new evangelization. We intend here the proclamation of the good news, yes, but specifically directed to those who have fallen away in their Catholic faith, those whose faith has been choked or uprooted, as it were, assaulted as it is by agnosticism, indifference, moral relativism, consumerism, or hedonism, and also those who have a merely nominal or passive affiliation with the Catholic Church. The thing is, sadly, we have young people among these categories. And yet, this is now the amazing thing. It's a real expression of enthusiastic optimism. Pope Francis, in Christus Vivit, as you can guess, he calls on young people to be fearless missionaries, ready to embark on a borderless and limitless mission, especially to those in the fringes of society. He counts on them to share the joy of the gospel. Lastly, and also very briefly, we specify youth ministry as ecclesial youth ministry, or more particularly, Catholic youth ministry. And so there you are, having established this perspective, this context and background. Therefore, we embark on looking now one by one at the principles I have developed, the principles of youth ministry from the perspective of the new evangelization. So to start off, principle number one: youth ministry is founded on both the theological and social sciences, for which it goes far beyond mere programs, events, and activities. Exactly, those last things I said, programs, events, and activities, those are what we immediately and typically see at once, no, in youth ministry. But nevertheless, we assert that it operates on an entirely higher and more solid level, thanks precisely to its foundations. The social and educational sciences, sociology, psychology, and so on, while relatively established already in relation to youth ministry, they have provided a sure and safe launching pad for youth ministry ever since. Whereas the theological sciences, on the other hand, are a relatively new development and therefore make up an exciting field for youth ministry as well, as I will now show you. And this is what I will emphasize more, this side of the tandem. Yes, it is particularly in the theological sciences where we observe a happy leveling up of late. First, there is nowadays an intentional rejection of narrow and shallow categories which render youth ministry as mere activities. Look at the next slide. These are the covers of some recent books. Just look at the titles alone. They are very indicative. I don't have to read them. No. Just a comment that last set of books, those four, they have a similar cover by the same author. They actually form a series, a theological journey through youth ministry. Moreover, we are also witnessing nowadays the steady emergence of youth theologies and theologies for youth ministry, maybe in this half century or so, very much in the mold of the so-called adjectival theologies. You're familiar with this third world theology, feminist theology, liberation theology, black theology, and so on. And then also very solidly settled in the specific field of pastoral theology, together with its necessary connections and intersections, particularly Christology, soteriology, ecclesiology, anthropology, scriptures, etc. There are several theologians from Europe, Latin America, and North America. They have been championing the efforts regarding youth theologies and theologies for youth ministry. These are the pioneering German pastoral theologians, the late Riccardo Tonelli of Italy, CELAM also, the Latin American Episcopal Conference, and then the Americans, Ken de Creasy Dean, Tony Jones, Andrew Root, Cara Powell, Jeffrey Castor, and so on. Hopefully, we here in Asia and also those in Africa and in Oceania can also pitch in with our contributions. Incidentally, I have also argued in a past conference I gave in the Theological Seminary of the Diocese of Malolos that the apostolic exhortation Christus Vivit, familiar to all of us, I'm sure, it also works very well as a theology of or for youth ministry too. Just a quick parenthesis here. This is now a special case in point. No, this recent or very recent publication, it's an anthology, Doing Theology and Theological Ethics in the Face of the Abuse Crisis. Yes, the sexual abuse crisis is something which for years now cannot be set aside. And it continues to haunt and to hound us in youth ministry. This is so for the simple reason that most, if not all, of the victims are young people. And now with this, it has become a locus theologicus as well. We are getting the impression so far that because of this, youth ministry has unfortunately become somewhat intimidating, arcane, and for the chosen few only, for specialists, in other words. Can't we just be content with the usual fun and games kind of youth ministry? There is certainly a value, a usefulness in having a theology and a pedagogy undergirding our ministry, making clear for us and helping us to reflect on the rationales and the basis of our praxis. We have come a long way by now, and there is no turning back. We are not interested in producing technicians or programmers in youth ministry. Rather, reflective practitioners are what we are after. By now, theological reflection can very well be part of the formation of youth ministers as one of their competencies too. Principle number 2. Young people, both as the agents and the recipients in youth ministry, are all in an exciting stage of personal growth and development. This is something very obvious ever since. We don't even need much psychology to tell us this. What is interesting is how Vatican II has picked this up, taking consideration of the social unrest of youth in the turbulent 60s. Gaudium et Spes described them as rebellious in their distress, to which Apostolicam Actuositatem adds, They are experiencing a complete transformation in the circumstances of their life, their habits of thought, and their relations with their families. That even here, Vatican II drew a positive pastoral implication that young people have a greater responsibility for the active apostolate. This gave rise to what used to be called peer ministry. And indeed, it is right that the youth be the very protagonists themselves in youth ministry. They are indeed active agents more than merely passive recipients. However, adults will still have a role to play, of course. By no means have they been boxed out of youth ministry. They can surely serve as guides, coaches, and mentors to the youth. With the experience and wisdom they supposedly have, they will complement perfectly the energy and enthusiasm of the young, which precisely the elders may not have anymore. Hopefully, this exchange serves as an antidote as well to paternalism. The growth and development, the energy and zeal of the youth certainly has its locus, and this is no other than life itself. The ordinary daily life of the youth is where they live their spirituality, for instance. A few of them will hopefully enter our convents and seminaries, but for the greater majority who are called to single or married life, routine duties and tasks, let's say in the course of a day, when done in an extraordinary way, they become pleasing gifts to the Lord. Thanks indeed to the incarnation of God, life itself becomes the tangible venue or forum for young people in youth ministry. The innate vivacity and vibrancy of the young people, their gifts and talents, all these are effectively channeled into good and placed at the service of others. And then youth ministry also becomes necessarily developmental. It takes the youth where they are, accompanying them as they go through the critical stages in their growth, in their transitions from childhood to adulthood. Such dynamics in the youth give rise as well to the so-called youth culture. It is not only the individual young person who is the subject of youth ministry, but also youth as a defined sociological sector or even a generation with its own label, with its own traits and characteristics. This youth culture becomes the point of departure, the avenue, and the context of our youth ministry. And this being the case, the priority and precedence belong to the youth. We meet them where they are, and we listen, of course, to them. As youth ministers, we cannot just arbitrarily impose what we might think as good for them, for the young. We can even be mistaken in that. Instead, we will often have to just let them be. And we, for our part, are at least open to their likes and dislikes, to what wakes them up in the morning, to what keeps them glued to their gadgets at night, and so on. And yes, including K pop. Now, of course, we will have to educate and mold them and offer them still what may also seem strange at first to their tastes. But nevertheless, we youth ministers are required to be familiar with youth culture, which incidentally may also well be multicultural nowadays, thanks to the forces of globalization. In the end, an authentic enculturation and contextualization are both essential and useful also in and for youth ministry. Principle number three, an ideal and authentic youth ministry will have to be qualified by certain dimensions and characteristics, just so that it may be worthy of the name. For this principle, allow me to invoke a bit of English grammar and mathematics in an accommodated and appropriated sense. We have here certain prepositions and adjectives to go along with our concept of youth ministry, and then also afterwards some mathematical equations, so to say. So first, the dimensions of youth ministry, they can be formulated and illustrated with the help of four prepositions: to, with, for, and by. They illustrate very concisely the four ways by which youth ministry relates with young people: to youth, with youth, for youth, and by youth. These four are constitutive and integral for a genuine youth ministry, meaning to say all the four must be present in order to have a complete, comprehensive, and integral youth ministry. A youth minister who only does a service to the youth risks reducing them to merely passive recipients. In the same line of thought, young people have practically been abandoned by adult ministers, leaving them to fend for themselves, and therefore everything is carried out just by them. It might end up in a mess. Once again, for a complete, comprehensive, and integral youth ministry to take place, everything must be done to, with, for, and by youth. As for the adjectives, there can be several of them to qualify the youth ministry that we are aspiring to, but we will settle for these four, which we feel are crucial and essential. And these four, as you can see, synodal and popular, as given by Pope Francis in Christus Vivit, and then communitarian, that is to say, not something delegated only, not to one youth minister, and also intergenerational, involving adults, parents, and seniors as well, side by side with the youth. And then there are also the equations I was mentioning, in quotation marks. There you are. And by this, I intend that youth ministry is equal both to vocations ministry and to family ministry. They are not as though three separate ministries or three separate offices or departments. I say they are equated and identified with each other: youth ministry, vocations ministry, and family ministry. All three of them essentially one and the same. If youth ministry were not vocations ministry, it would be a barren or sterile youth ministry, good only for keeping the kids busy, but without accompanying and helping them at all to find their mission in life. A youth ministry cut off from family ministry, on the other hand, ends up being what I call a criminal youth ministry. By this, I mean that it's as if we kidnap the youth, snatching them out of their most basic and most natural environment, the first setting of their life, of their growth and development, the family. We end up conducting our own ministry with the youth only, cut off from their parents, receiving them and not helping them at all to face their family dynamics. And so, as you can see by now, youth ministry is multidimensional and multifaceted, and also holistic and integral. Indeed, we cannot reduce youth ministry into a parody or into, let's say, to use the words of an American Catholic youth minister, a caricature of babysitting. We would be doing youth ministry a great disservice if that were the case. We would be shortchanging our young people. So that's principle number 3. We proceed. Number 4, an ensemble of actions. Such is the diversity and variety in youth ministry. As a matter of fact, it is not only the dimensions and characteristics of youth ministry which make it lively and authentic. When you now consider the wide variety leading to so many possibilities, we realize that we are indeed in a very exciting arena. Youth ministry can certainly be more than just, for example, a sports only or a catechesis only or a socials only program. Paradoxically, youth ministry is a very specialized and focused field directed towards a particular sector in church and society, requiring special skills and paradigms. But at the same time, it operates on a wide open field. This kind of arrangement thereby allows a lot of room for creativity and zeal on the part of the youth minister, for example. Moreover, there can be several possible models to follow in youth ministry, paradigmatically and organizationally speaking, and using in particular the animation paradigm. The possibilities are almost endless. Youth ministry can definitely tap and harness. There you are. So many music, sports, hobbies, arts, literature, digital technology, travel and tourism, volunteerism and activism, etc. All for the sake of the young. There will be a separate principle touching on spirituality next to this. But even now, I'd like to say that yes, even spirituality too benefits from this diversity and variety in youth ministry. Since we want to have an understanding of spirituality for youth ministry, which would be as wide and as varied as possible, we are able to expand its scope and coverage so as to include especially marginalized young people. We are definitely against the alienation and marginalization of youth also as regards to spirituality. Young people admittedly have already been exploited, excluded, and marginalized enough in education, in social involvement, in church participation. We cannot allow the same thing to happen when it comes to spirituality. Our prayer meetings, for example, Bible study groups, retreats, and recollections for youth should not be only for an elite few. They ought to be broad enough to allow and welcome diverse persuasions and therefore inclusive. Note that even seemingly passive and indifferent youth can still have a spiritual life, which, weak as it may seem, actually renders them at least open to the transcendent. And then, as for the components and settings in youth ministry, there is an almost astonishing assortment as well. What is good is that the whole thing doesn't end up in confusion, thanks to frameworks which arrange and categorize them. As examples of such frameworks, first we have the one of the US document renewing the vision for the components. Under this framework are the following. I don't need to read them one by one, but as you can see, it is so varied and diverse. In such a comprehensive scheme, everything there is there in youth ministry, as in everything. You can think of any event or activity in youth ministry, whether typical or special, anything, and surely it can be placed under any of those categories we have seen there, or even under two or three of them at the same time, because the boundaries between one component and another are not watertight. In fact, they also overlap. And then we also have that of the Kalakbay, the Directory for Catholic Youth Ministry in the Philippines, regarding now the settings. There can be the formal settings, such as parishes, youth centers, campuses or educational institutions, dormitories or boarding houses, centers for youth at risk, ecclesial organizations and movements, BECs, families, and other emerging settings. Or there can also be the informal settings, those with no fixed structures or those not following any formal plan or program. If I may just add, there is yet another important and all-encompassing setting which we must include for present-day youth ministry. And that is, maybe you can guess, the setting of cyberspace or social media. Who knows if we can still keep track of the huge number, probably gazillions of videos, calls, conferences, webinars, and meetings, songs, podcasts, pics, photos, infographics, images, newsletters, ebooks, e-mags, e-journals, and e-articles, all present in the internet. Thanks to Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Zoom, and so on, all pertaining to or connected with youth ministry, not to mention ChatGPT. And now, as though this great and vast variety were not yet enough, we have it even further heightened when we consider the manifold skills present in the praxis of youth ministry. And so we have, for instance, management and leadership skills, planning and programming skills, organizational and logistical skills, social communication and social media skills, and also study and research techniques and methods, like in the manner of cultural anthropology, exposure, participation, and immersion techniques, data gathering, surveying, interviewing, and so on. So this is very consoling for those of us who do not know how to play the guitar, or who are not tech savvy, or do not have the terpsichorean skills for TikTok videos and reels. Don't worry. This diversity and variety demand, or we might even say they foster a certain coordination, collaboration, and cooperation. These are to be directed both within and intra, and without ad extra, as in unity and cohesion for the former, and then networking and solidarity for the latter. If this were lacking, it would be to the detriment of youth ministry. The result would be highly lamentable. Human considerations such as envy and jealousy, division and partisanship ought to be set aside in favor of obtaining and maintaining what can truly be a cohesive and comprehensive youth ministry. Finally, it is important to consider the so-called multiplier or ripple effect for a vibrant youth ministry. If Article 24 of Evangelii states the person who has been evangelized goes on to evangelize others, then we can expect and even demand that true ministry should duplicate itself. Youth groups in parishes, for instance, should not be breeding grounds for power-hungry individuals, clinging to the leadership positions as if they are staying in youth ministry forevermore, without terms of office. Similarly, a youth group which has become stagnant with the same few members year in, year out, that is indicative of poor or zero witnessing and recruitment. No wonder many groups die natural deaths without the infusion of fresh blood. If there are, for example, healthy recruitment and leadership formation programs in place, there will be more chances for others to grow and lead. Then the turnover for officers is guaranteed, and the groups become catalysts for renewal. Principle number 5, youth ministry should arrive at spirituality as its apex. It should essentially lead young people to a relationship with God in Jesus Christ and with others. Being the essential element that it is, spirituality elevates youth ministry to a higher dimension. This is what sets our youth ministry apart and above mere humanitarian endeavors, as in educational and social services by non-church or non-governmental organizations, for instance. They all seem to be one and the same, now for all intents and purposes. But ours in the church has a higher goal. Youth ministry, after all, was never intended to be a merely a service profession. Come to think of it, spirituality shouldn't even be the icing on top of the cake of youth ministry. In the first place, teenagers and young adults are in a time of growth and transition, but they are also in a time which is considered most sensitive and receptive to the Spirit. Yes, they rebel against the church and claim to be agnostics, but beneath their masks is a cry for help, a yearning for meaning. And so the present day rediscovery and renaissance now in spirituality and youth ministry serves us very well. This spirituality is essentially active, apostolic, and missionary. And then, of course, also while there are distinct expressions under this spirituality, which are very varied, for instance, in prayer and devotions, the common ground is in our being relational men and women. Spirituality thus embraces a total 360-degree collective of relationships in the life of the young person. First, relationship with God in Christ, and then with oneself, with others, that is to say, family and friends, with nature or the environment, and also with material possessions. To give it all a name and a face, I will have to say that among all the saints, Saint Francis of Assisi may very well be the exemplar for this, without prejudice, of course, to other uber popular young saints like Maria Goretti and Blessed Carlo Acutis. Just one more note, this spirituality we are advocating as the apex of youth ministry should not be detached or dichotomized from religion. The mutual interrelationship between the two is as helpful as enriching, ideally speaking, at least. Unfortunately, for some young people, religion has become an obstacle to their spiritual life. Such a situation needs to be remedied. And with religion factored in as well as a grassroots ecumenism and interreligious dialogue can be practiced, especially in large scale youth gatherings such as those of Kaiser and Relief Days. And lastly, we now arrive at the sixth and the final principle. Given that the new evangelization is for us the overarching perspective of our principles, youth ministry likewise sees its raison d'etre in it. The well-loved and well-remembered father of the Youth Encounter Formation Program here in the Philippines, the late Monsignor Jose King Molina, he also left behind some writings whereby he clarified how precisely can youth ministry relate with evangelization and catechesis. More importantly, he advocated the necessity of the new evangelization as a vital component in youth ministry as well. This is because many of our youth are perhaps unaware of or even take for granted progressive and developmental stages in the faith. Majority have been baptized typically as infants. New evangelization is necessary. Young people need to encounter God in a personal way, experience a conversion of mind and heart rooted in the ways and teachings of Jesus, and express this choice freely, personally, and consciously. That is why it cannot be otherwise, and that the raison d'etre of youth ministry would be anything else apart from the new evangelization. In the first place, youth ministry is located in the very heart of the church, and it shares in her mission. In fact, it is the very same mission itself of the church, but directed to a specific sector and carried out in a style that befits its beneficiaries. In the first place, the church carries out a sincere ministry to and for the young, coming from an underlying option precisely for them. It is all in imitation of God Himself, who casts a loving gaze on the young throughout the history of salvation, from Abel in Genesis, and then Mary of Nazareth as the culmination, all the way until the rich young man and Timothy. The church now likewise continues in such a godlike preferential option for the young. She counts on their collaboration in the challenges and tasks of the new evangelization. Besides, God becoming man in the person of Jesus Christ sets the pattern or paradigm for ministry. Such indeed is the incarnation, the Jesus event, the good news which is fecund, joyful, and life giving. And so must youth ministry likewise be. It not only does it rejuvenate the church, youth ministry itself continues and develops with a new enthusiasm in a new language and with new methodologies. With all these, we can hence look ahead and afar. And this trajectory affords us a bright and clear vision, one that is faith based and contextualized, with clear goals, bold options, and well defined objectives, ready and willing to be translated onto determined lines of action. Evangelizing youth ministry may as well be the term for this quest of ours, or as the author Greg Steer coined the term, a gospelized youth ministry. And so there you are. Just a note, it would have been nice to hear something like the seven principles of youth ministry from the perspective of new evangelization, just like the seven wonders of the world, the Magnificent Seven, the Seven Sacraments, the Seven Capital Sins, and what have you. If you are paying attention carefully to my talk, you may have noticed that I gave you only 6 principles, not 7. But still, I can reiterate, there should really be 7, if only to follow the trend, no, and to keep intact that magic number. I gave you 6 principles only because the remaining one, the seventh, you will have to formulate it yourself. That's your take home assignment. Yes, I mean it. You yourselves would have to be the one to conclude it by adding your own seventh principle. In this way, you will be able to personalize what you have heard from me this morning. Conclusion. I mentioned Don Bosco in the beginning, right? Do you know what exactly was he doing in his prison ministry back then? He would befriend the young prisoners, talk with them, and occasionally bring them, you know what, fruit, tobacco, bread rolls, and so on. I'm saying this because there's this confer of mine who is also a youth minister and professor. He was talking about the icebreaker which he would be using in some of his talks. He would ask his audience, if you were to visit young juvenile delinquents in prison, children in conflict with the law, what questions would you ask them first? So he was trying that out now with his audience, no? And maybe also now, no, but we don't have time anymore. Anyway, the result was that he would get funny, wrong answers. Just like, for instance, I will ask them, what's your name? You're supposed to know that already, no? Or why did you commit that particular crime? No? As the Italians would say, oh, you don't ask such questions at once. Maybe later you can ask them, no? Instead, a good one to ask, according to this confer of mine, would be simply, what do you think? I'll say it in Tagalog. Kumain ka na ba? Translation. Have you eaten yet? Just like Don Bosco, you disarm the young offender. You win over his confidence. You connect with him in a simple and friendly way. Then perhaps you can rehabilitate him little by little. And then even pull back the entire thing by preventing others from ending up like them in prison by means of education and faith formation. That's youth ministry in a nutshell. And so, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear brothers and sisters, let me just say it again that we have certainly come a long way in our youth ministry. And the best part is that the territory where we are trekking in now is not anymore strange and unknown. It's also true that youth ministry is still continuously evolving. That's why we cannot stop and just relax by the wayside. A bright future awaits us all, but I must add, we must not give in to what I call futurism, that wrong and lazy way of thinking that the church is only a community of adults, and the only reason why we make a current investment in youth is because one day they will be part of that adult community. No. Young people are both the future and the present, the here and now. And so, side by side with them, we can look forward to a bright and beautiful panorama. Together with them, we can embark on a noble quest, provided that we are stable, well grounded, and clearly directed by our foundational principles, actions, and convictions, all for an evangelizing youth ministry. Maraming salamat.